All right, it is Wednesday, June 1st. My goodness, June already, 2022. We have a great show today for you. We have a great guest from the Air Force. We're going to hear all about this new word called AFWERX. And we have a sub for our own Dr. John Sibley Butler. And so I am going to go to Linda Gasparella for some music.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Andres. And today, in honor of the Queen's 70th Jubilee, and in honor of the fact that Llewellyn King, my husband, grew up in Africa. He was a British subject, and we are going to sing a duet.
Oh, no, we're not, but keep going.
But certainly, Llewellyn knows two songs. One is God Save the Queen. The other one is the Donkey Serenade. And I don't know the words to the Donkey Serenade, but I can manage God Save the Queen. So here we go. God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious. Long shall she reign over us. God save the Queen.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, charge your glasses. The Queen.
The Queen.
The Queen.
All right, well, that's nothing to do with high tech, but she's lived a long time, so maybe it has something to do with high tech.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Well, Linda, tell us, how are you? What's going on? How do you see the world? The economy continues to melt down. Gas in California hit $8. People are frantic. COVID may be coming back in some shape or form. What say you?
It's all of the above, and we're feeling the pain, and we're feeling the pain a lot. The incredible inflation that continues, and President Biden, who says he's going to get his arms around it. We've seen a little bit of a decrease in it as a result of the Fed's moves, but it's got to go a lot faster. And frankly, the Fed's moves should have begun a lot earlier. Federal Reserve chairmen don't like to begin a president's term with a lot of moves, with a lot of dramatic moves. But in this case, they should have been done early. And so we're going to feel this for a long time. We're going to feel the impact of the Ukraine war for a long time. We're already seeing it in food, and we're seeing it in energy. So it's a pain that's not going to go away fast. We're still having supply shortages, and they're exacerbated by a lot of these things that I've already mentioned. Yeah.
Unfortunately, all true. Llewellyn King, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. And I have nothing to add to what Linda has said. We're in for a very bumpy ride. It's going to be bumpy for a long time. I think the consequences are going to be that we're going to try all sorts of short-term things, including what will happen in the midterm elections, and it will not solve anything. We're going to have 2 years of inflation, of high prices, till a new equilibrium is established. Eventually, there will be a resolution in Ukraine, but then an enormous amount of money will be needed to rebuild a very large country, which will largely have been leveled. There are 44 million people. It is going to need tremendous amount of international aid, and that means a lot of American aid. So it's a long, expensive haul ahead. Nothing very encouraging as we head to the beach. If we can get there, don't fly, try and drive. It's very expensive, but you might get there. Flights are being canceled all the time. It is a very bad time. We as Americans are fortunate. We're not actually suffering except financially. We're not suffering in other ways. But coming on top of COVID-19, it is a cruel blow that we should have this war and the attendant costs that it is leveling on everyone. Leon Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And that is what we are seeing now. I was in touch with a journalistic friend of mine who was a bit dismissive of Europe, but what is happening in Europe is having a very direct effect on the rest of the world and cannot be ignored. We will come through, we will get, there will be more supply of everything that's in short supply. The production will go up, the cost will come down, there'll be equilibrium. But I say it'll take 3 years to achieve, and it's going to be difficult. What is different from other similar periods is that we won't certainly get depression, or at least recession, because that is normally accompanied by unemployment, and we have super full employment. People are begging, looking for workers, and that's a new wrinkle in an old crisis.
Yeah, very well said. So our guest today is James Foutz. And James, how are you, sir?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me on.
I'm curious about something, maybe not. Are you related to this football player, Dan Foutz?
No, he threw the ball much better than I did.
Okay. Just curious. Well, thanks for joining us today. And we're happy to have you. And for those that are listening and don't know about you, I want to introduce you formally. A little bit of that. So James is the acquisitions program manager and data leader at AFWERX-Austin Hub. He has agreed to be with us for an hour, and we're going to talk all kinds of things related to Top Gun and fun things like that, and mobile devices and the world of transportation in the future. Prior to AFWERX, James was a weather forecaster at the Texas Air National Guard, a senior systems analyst at the city of Austin, so a colleague of mine, a marketing and conservation manager and business analyst at the city of Georgetown, which I believe is where he lives and resides now, and a weather forecaster at the U.S. Air Force, among other things. Brian holds a Bachelor of Business Administration from Lamar University and a Associate Science something, ASS, I don't know what that stands for, in meteorology from Community College of the Air Force. What is an ASS?
I think it stands for Associates of Applied Sciences.
There you go. So you are, for all intended purposes, a data junkie and a forecaster.
Yeah, that's kind of the where it all began. I loved numbers, like growing up as a kid, with sports, and then weather. It's all about predicting the future, right? So it's a kind of a marrying of looking at numbers and looking people in the face and telling them something's going to happen when you're hoping it's true, but it might not be.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Exactly what I would describe you. You're a bit of a Merlin magician, look in the glass, predict the future kind of guy. So we're in for a treat, guys. So real quick, James, before we turn you loose, the Air Force is a magnificent organization. AFWERX is, as I understand it, a new attempt. Not that the Air Force hasn't tried this in the past, but it's a new attempt under a new mission and goal to really accelerate the commercialization of industries and technologies that would help the long-term mission of the Air Force of sorts. Tell us in your own words, what's your take on AFWERX and the Air Force in that new gestation of, if you will, a business unit within the big business?
Yeah, for sure, 100%. So yeah, in simple terms, AFWERX, we kind of frame ourselves as the innovation team of the Air Force. Sometimes that it's a relatively new organization, And, innovation and large federal government agencies don't always, seem synonymous, but that's one of the things we're trying to turn around. So we are focused on kind of three areas, the organization itself. We have a team that's focused on like airmen at the grassroots level. We consider it like grassroots innovation, where you're trying to figure out what problems exist at the individual user level at an Air Force base, wherever they could be. There's the other aspect, which is our ventures team, and they're really looking at the commercialization aspect of various technologies, right? So I think it begins with the understanding that there are a lot of smart people out in the world doing a lot of cool things, and a lot of that comes out of the startup space. And so we look to a lot of those small businesses to see what solutions they're working on and how can we bring those commercial technologies into the Air Force. And then the third kind of key pillar we have is called Prime. And that's really looking at more long-term type of technology development. So I think the one that's probably gotten the most attention is called Agility Prime. So if you think of like electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, that's really where that team stood up their program at. So Prime is really thinking of like priming a commercial market. So that was a space where there wasn't necessarily a commercial market developed, but there was an identified defense need. So, hey, let's see if we can help prime that commercial market for these companies, so that they can commercialize their products.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do at Texas State is smart mobility is one of our key lab verticals, and we're building 3 labs there related to mobility. But I would be remiss to remind everybody that, and maybe you heard it here first now, that TAS, TAAS, Transportation as a Service, will probably be the largest wealth creation opportunity and transformation of technology in the next 30 years, estimated to be an $11 trillion market. So it is the fusion of electrification of vehicles, changes in transportation, primarily around drones and VTOLs, and then the whole notion of the gig economy, all coming together at the same time. And I think that one of the things that I had heard from some of your colleagues, James, is the notion that the Air Force is really interested in accelerating all kinds of technologies and trying to figure out what the new transport devices or vehicles look like or could be, not just for the masses, but ultimately for engagement in defense of the country. Anything you can share on that in terms of what is the thinking, sort of short term, long term on that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic, because I think when you talk about like the different use cases that can hop out of some of these, because like flying cars, the concept is really cool, but really it comes down to what are those use cases. And so if you think about like here in Austin or any major city, right, you have search and rescue type capabilities that all those cities have, or if you have like an accident in downtown Austin, you're at the mercy of the surface transportation, right? But there's a faster way to get to that. Similarly, on a battlefield, right? Like combat search and rescue is one of the aspects. So, and those fundamentally are essentially the same thing. You're trying to get the shortest path to whatever your casualty is to render aid of some sort. Also like distributed logistics, right? I think Amazon's kind of the one that gets the drone delivery kind of aspect, but there's also a need that we see with like these vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, that you can have a little greater capacity, but the same thing exists on a battlefield, right? So it's really just capitalizing on all the space above the surface to deliver capability in whatever use case it could be: logistics, casualty care, troop transportation, all kinds of various things, air taxis, right? Like that's another concept that comes up.
Absolutely. Linda?
James, are you also working on the air traffic control aspect of this? Because I see the future as I would love the future of being able to take off vertically and get out of traffic. But I know this needs to be controlled, as to all of the distribution drones that are going to be flying out there with Amazon. So update us on what you're doing on that aspect.
Yeah, I think that's probably, and I think the cool part is the vehicle itself, but there's all the other ancillary technologies that have to go into place to make something like that successful. How do you control the flight space? Because on the surface, it's a much smaller environment in reality. But if you think about airspace, now that becomes a much larger environment and the need to control, especially if you start populating it with drones, manned aircraft, unmanned aircraft, right? Those whole things. So the aspects of all these technology pieces that enable that central technology of the aircraft itself, I think that's probably where you have some really accelerated growth. The control mechanisms, also just simply how do you, if you have a person in that vehicle controlling it, like, is the interface more simplified so you don't have to have a true rated or licensed pilot to be in that vehicle? Somebody can control it, with a simplified user interface kind of thing. So there's a lot of cool technologies that go around that, to include, I know energy is kind of one of the key pieces, right? How do you, as density for energy storage improves, can you improve the flight time for some of these aircraft as well? So yeah, I think that's a really exciting part of it, is all the ancillary technologies that go into making something like that possible.
Let me ask you, James, how does the Air Force deal with the intellectual property aspects of technologies coming out of the Air Force? I did some work years ago with the national laboratories, and this was a huge issue. Technology transfer often had a tail of intellectual property investment, and there were various elaborate systems, none of them perfect, for trying to deal with it so that the inventor got her due or his due, and the organization that had housed it and made the invention possible got its due, in this case, the Air Force.
Yeah, so I probably won't be able to answer this as well as others, but I think the kind of the idea is that we get access to the technology. We don't actually take ownership of the technologies, I don't believe, but that gives the inventor or the company a dedicated customer. But ultimately, like with these programs, we're trying to, we don't want to be the only customer for most of these technologies. And so we want those companies or the inventor to still retain the ability to go and commercialize this with other entities.
A follow-up question related somewhat. Technology that's moving to the front line, to the battlefield, is sometimes inhibited by regulation on how technology evolves. I think the classic case was 3D printing, where people wanted to build print spare parts for combat vehicles, including Jeeps. But the regs said they had to be certified back in Ohio or somewhere, so that all the gain was negated if you had to build the part in Afghanistan and fly it to Ohio to be checked. Have you run into that, and how are you dealing with it?
Yeah, we actually have, and we have a company here locally in Austin where they're actually working on trying to get through some of that challenge as well, where they're 3D printing aircraft parts. And the idea is that we'll work with these companies to essentially create the path for them to go through their airworthiness process. And that's part of the kind of the partnership that we have with them, is we give them access to kind of like those test facilities, especially with the Prime team. They get access to some of the test facilities so that we can facilitate that certification, if you will, so that those technologies are more easily adopted. Because yeah, that is the challenge. If somebody is out at the very like the end user can 3D print something in their office, doesn't mean they can put it on an aircraft. So but if we can identify that need and pull that testing upstream a bit, then we can deploy that capability out.
Mm-hmm. So
I can tell you this: the airlines at the moment would like to 3D print some pilots
Not enough pilots? So do you see your logo here, James? Do you see the
I-
logo?
I do. I see it.
Nice, nice. We're ready for every occasion. Thank you for tell Colonel Salinas that was very gracious for him to speak last year. Our annual event is coming up, and I'll be plugging in a minute. But real quick, tell us about, how massive is this? Like AFWERX, what are we talking about? I mean, the Air Force is a big organization. So what is behind AFWERX? $100 million, 2,000 people. What does it look like? What can you share around that?
Yeah, so AFWERX from a team, we're really in a build the team kind of phase. So total staff, I would venture to guess we're probably about 150, counting military, civilian, and contractors. Our budget is really centered around the Small Business Innovation Research program that's actually utilizing SBA, Small Business Administration funds. And so we administer that pot of money for the Air Force, and that's about $1 billion roughly, where we can use those funds to fund some of these startup technologies, as long as they meet the criteria of the SITR program outlined by the SBA. Then we can fund those companies in different levels. And so right now we have essentially 3 phases. We have the ability to fund some companies at the front end, where it's essentially a white paper. They can generate a white paper identifying the defense need for their commercial technology. We can fund that at a small level. And then the next phase is they identify a customer that they can go build a prototype with. That opens up the opportunity for additional funding. And then there's like the longer term kind of procurement processes that they can go into as well.
Now tell us real quick, perhaps, James, some of the fun companies or more interesting companies or hot technology companies that you guys have funded that you can share.
Yeah,
just a quick rattle on those.
Yeah, so I'll pick on one of the local ones because it's a pretty cool company, and coming from my background in the city environment where housing's always a challenge, but they 3D print houses. So there's a company here locally called Icon, and they essentially have the ability to do 3D printed concrete structures. And so they came in pretty early on, and then they went through the entire process to where they actually last year 3D printed 2 barracks at one of the Texas Army National Guard training facilities here in Texas. So that's probably the one that I like to talk about the most, because they came in very early, and they're local, so it's easy to talk about the local.
Got it. What about what's your take on when you look at the opportunities they're coming to you guys, not what you have funded, but the opportunities? How many of those opportunities are companies that are building actually drones or flight devices versus software for controls, or versus artificial intelligence? Where do you see the biggest pipeline flow coming to you guys? What types of companies are there?
Yeah, I mean, really good question. I think that's I would say it runs the gamut. Probably the most that we see here locally in Austin, probably center around the software space. And I think that's just by virtue of the Austin area. So we do see a lot of technology companies coming out. AI and machine learning companies are a big one right now. We also have a lot of movement in the space environment. So just startup companies getting after some of the space problems, especially because now with the new Space Force and SpaceWorks, which is our counterpart that is working with the Space Force specifically. So I think, and that's just a new problem set that is a really fast growing space. So I think that's probably the bulk of them is software, technologies around that, and then space, like I said, is a really big chunk here recently.
Linda?
James, do you hold the equivalent of job fairs, to get the AFWERX message out there? around the country. I mean, I can see that here in the Northeast, we would sort of love a chance to be able to participate in one of your programs. So we've got software engineers and galore, and other people, I think, that in 3D printing, et cetera, that would really love that opportunity. So how do you get the word out about, you're fairly new, so how do you get the word out about what you're doing?
Yeah, so we just did a hiring push. So we did bring on, or we're still in the process of bringing on a fair amount of people. So our team will probably double here in the next 6 months, and that was all done virtually. So most of that push was, via our HR team and marketing team, just trying to spread the word far and wide. And we're pretty distributed as a team in general. So our office is here in Austin. We also have some folks that are, on the East Coast in the capital area. We have folks out in Las Vegas. So we've kind of done some word of mouth. But yeah, I think the biggest push right now has all been virtually, just to try and get the word out. Like, if you want to join the team, come on.
How receptive is the Air Force to the radical? Something that is quite different. I've often wondered if a young engineer came up with an entirely new design for an airframe, whether anyone would take any notice of that young idea. They would say they would, but there are so many levers in any large organization marked no, and so few marked yes. The chances of a really radical idea getting through aren't very great in most institutions.
Yeah, I would say so. I joined the Air Force as an enlisted member back in 2003. So I would say, if you asked me that question in 2003, I would have probably said there is next to no chance, if I had a good idea, that it would make it through the wickets to be something that other people could leverage. I would say now, and really it comes from the top, with General Brown, who his foot stomp when he first took over as a chief of staff was, accelerate, change, or lose, right? So that kind of message has to come from the top, and we're fortunate that we do have at the very top levels of the Air Force folks who are pushing for us to be more innovative, not only in technologies, but just in how we look at problems in general, because not everything requires like a new shiny toy. Some of it's, you just need to change the way you think about what you're doing currently. So one of the things that's been kind of a hallmark of the AFWERX effort is we have these things called spark cells, and they're at individual base locations where it's essentially a base level team of folks who they start out as volunteers to tackle local problems with innovative solutions. So the environment over from the time that I joined to where we are now is radically different, where you do have people at the very top who are, touting the benefits of being innovative in your thought and in the way you're kind of processing problems, but we're also enabling people at the bases. So if you went down to San Antonio, you would find airmen who have the ability to go try 3D printing, who have the ability to do some of these cool things that you didn't really have access to 20 years ago. So I would say there's actually, right now, there's probably a better chance that innovative ideas make it to a fielded level in the Air Force, probably greater than any other time over the last 20 to 25 years.
So James, one of the things that I think it's important to understand is your guys' take on electrification and energy. Clearly, I don't know how many people know that, in order to start an F-18 or any of these vehicles, you need to basically wake them up, turn them on. You need power, you need a grid or a microgrid of sorts. How important is to the long-term vision of AFWERX the whole notion of energy and electrification?
Yeah, I think energy has, at least as long as I've been with AFWERX, energy has been a conversation that repeatedly pops up, both energy and water. So those kind of like core services, because if you think about the mission of any military service, Air Force, Army, Navy, otherwise, energy is kind of at the foundation of what we do. So if I need to launch an aircraft, I need energy. If I am going to set up some kind of operating location anywhere in the world, I have to have energy. And so that's a core planning problem that no matter what level of the military you're in, you're trying to figure out how to get energy and how to get water to those locations to feed both the requirements of the people, but also the equipment that those people are going to use, right? So yeah, it's a constant conversation. And actually, our big signature event every year is called Spark Tank, and it's kind of modeled after Shark Tank. But the winner this year was actually called Project Arcwater, and that was a project focused specifically on energy and water generation in kind of a portable unit, so that you can rapidly deploy that.
Very cool.
Can I ask you about forward deployment? How autonomous is the Air Force in its forward deployment? How much does it rely on fairly rigid supply lines, which has always been the curse of military supply lines? Some things which we thought would help, like irradiated food, never got off the ground. We've heard a lot of talk about small reactors, but they haven't actually happened yet, except in very limited ways in the space program, etc. Are we getting more? Is the forward-based unit getting more autonomous or less so?
I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I would say that we're trying to figure out how to become less. I think you're still at the mercy of supply chains, just because the end consumption of we're still flying aircraft that are fueled by JP-8. We're still using generators for the most part that are fueled by diesel, and then you'll see some vehicles that are electric, but the majority of the vehicles still consume gas. So I think as long as that's the case, you still are at the mercy of the supply chain that delivers those materials.
You used to be a weather forecaster. How sensitive is the Air Force to the weather at a time when we're seeing really radically different weather, where we're seeing aberrant weather everywhere, which certainly affects flying, but it also affects fixed bases and supply chains?
Yeah, so I think weather is one of the things that is kind of at the forefront as well. So I mean, I might be biased in saying that since I have the background in it, but there's also an initiative called the Base of the Future in the Air Force, and it really spawned out of some of the bases that were really affected by these natural disasters. So Tyndall had essentially like the direct hurricane hit, and so that's part of the look at when we think about things like core infrastructure services, be it energy, water, even the built environment around the structures themselves. How can you make those facilities more resilient? So I think that's really where the focus is, knowing that some locations are more susceptible to certain weather events. So how can you make those facilities resilient enough to withstand those types of events that eventually you can assume are going to occur?
James, have you had a lot of interest from companies working with you on information and secure networks? I would imagine that the Air Force is critically interested in that area.
Yeah, cybersecurity is always a big one. And even like some of the more innocuous technologies like software solutions, you would think that as a general consumer of technology, security isn't really one of the things you consider. But for us, like even if it's a basic application, we still have to consider the cybersecurity aspect. And so that's one of the challenges, regardless of the technology. Security is always going to be one of the things at the forefront if it's going to be something that's connecting to our network that's getting pushed out across the Air Force, because that's a key vulnerability. If you have something that you can't secure, that we have to make sure is secure.
Yeah, let me pause for a moment and share our Digital 360 Summit coming up. at the JW Marriott downtown, September 6th through the 9th. The first 3 days are the conference itself. The last day, the 9th, is the tour day of all the labs that we have built. By then, we will have opened up about 5 labs. So you definitely do not want to miss what's going on at Texas State Cedar. And it's going to be a wonderful conference. We are co-hosting with the Greater San Marcos Partnership Innovation Summit, which brings 300 people to the conference, and we probably will add another 300. So we're looking at a very robust conference. And this is the background that I have on my screen, and the picture of the logos of all the companies that spoke and sponsored last year. And again, a reminder of the work that we're doing at Texas State Cedar with the 9 labs and the focus on those verticals. And quick thank you to the university for sponsoring our Digital Roundtable. When you think about, is there, James, a correlation at all, or is the Air Force looking at this merging of terrestrial vehicles flying, and what does that mean? Is this a new frontier for the Air Force, or is the Air Force always been involved in sort of the side of autonomous vehicles and understanding vehicles and on the ground as well? Or is it, or is the VTOL sort of the first crossover that would make the Air Force kind of be in both terrains?
Yeah, I think the eVTOL space is probably the kind of the first foray into making that like a full-fledged capability. Like most of the capabilities that we have are, across the services are either land-based or air-based capabilities.
Right.
I think this is probably the first effort to get after that, apart from maybe like some research efforts. But I think this is the first one that we're getting after that's trying to deliver a capability.
Yeah, and clearly, the Air Force has, I'm not a true expert in any of that, but there are several airplanes that do, large airplanes that do take off vertically, right? And so it's clearly a desired capability. I'm just imagining the flexibility and it's the sort of the game changer that it would be to have vehicles that were, a lot more powerful in terms of density, flight time, lighter, more flexible, maneuverable, sort of like a helicopter kind of concept, right? But maybe a lot easier to maneuver.
Yeah, and they have a smaller footprint,
right?
Because you have some of those aircraft, like I think the last one that probably got a lot of publicity was the CV-22, and so that's kind of the twin engine. Looks kind of like a prop plane, but it can also vertically take off.
Right.
That was delivered, I don't know, probably a decade ago now, a little longer than that. But it's still a pretty large aircraft. I can't land that like on a city street in between buildings in Austin.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the difference, is like transitioning from like these larger aircraft. So how can you utilize this technology in a smaller?
Yeah.
It's a little bigger than a drone. Has some of the capabilities of a larger aircraft, but.
So if you were to pick a sci-fi movie that depicts where we're heading, is it Blade Runner 2029 more like it? Is that what it is? Blade Runner 2049.
I don't know. I hope not. That's a really dark world.
Well, but the vehicles, right? The vehicles.
That tells us something about Andres. He lives in a really dark world.
James, is the Air Force applying any of the ESG rules to the companies that you're selecting to work with? ESG has become quite a controversial concept, and I wondered whether it was very well knitted into the Air Force ethos, or whether the Air Force has its own.
And can you, Linda, explain to the listeners what the ESG is real quick?
It's environment, social, and governance. And it means that those aspects will be taken into consideration if you want to work with a bank, if you want to get a loan, if you want to, for shareholders, this is important. And I wonder whether or not that concept of environmental, social, and governance has really worked its way into the Air Force.
I don't know. I don't know that one for sure. For our programs, when we're looking at like the SIBR and SITR programs, that's not something explicitly that I think we look at. From a contracting level, I'm not sure though, like in the broader Air Force, if that's something that they take into consideration.
I'm interested to know how you interface with other research organizations serving the military. Obviously, ARPA is the large one, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, but you also have 17 national laboratories. You have dedicated Air Force laboratories, and each service has its own laboratories. I once did a conference in conjunction with Lawrence Livermore on microengineering, and I was amazed by how much duplication there was of effort in nanoengineering. It was, I mean, there were shades of difference in each program, but there were a great deal more, and they just weren't communicating very well with each other. Is that a problem? Are we wasting a lot of effort? Are good ideas hitting the equivalent of the cutting room floor?
Yeah, I think AFWERX, speaking for us, I think we're pretty fortunate in that we actually fall underneath the Air Force Research Laboratory. And that's where a lot of those academic relationships and research relationships are built. So we have a real fortunate circumstance in that we can run up through our command at AFRL to make those connections, either with our laboratories within the Air Force or even some of those academic relationships. We just stood up a partnership with, oh gosh, now I can't think of the name, University in Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon. So we just stood up that partnership. We have some folks that are now permanently up in Pittsburgh that are working with them. So I think for us, it's a tremendous benefit that we get to fall under the research lab, because it gives us access to that to try and, to your point, reduce some of the redundancy, but also to make sure that we can connect that end user problem with the researchers that are actively trying to research some of those very same problems.
What is the mechanism of your funding? Is it directly funded by the Air Force? Do you get grants? Is it a mixture of public and Air Force funding? Because it's a two-way street, isn't it?
Yeah, so the bulk of our funding comes from the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to administer out to those companies. So when we think about like the amount of money that we're executing, that's really where the bulk of it comes from. And then we do have, I think, probably some funding that comes through the Air Force. But like I said, the bulk of it is based around that SBA money.
So has Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, been working with Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, on getting this program properly funded?
I'm not sure. When you say properly funded,
no, just there's it's a startup. It's a startup, so it's hard to say what the level of funding should be.
Oh yeah.
Well, he mentioned that he mentioned earlier that they're managing $1 billion.
Yeah, exactly. But that's, the two secretaries have been in contact with each other about this program, which is really part of SBA.
Yeah, so I don't know if they are or not. I will say we're part of like the funded Air Force. So we're staffed with like military members. We're funded through the normal like budget processes that the Air Force goes through. So
Washington question.
So James, let me take a turn here on technology. So you are a weather forecaster. You've been in sort of with systems and technology for a long time. What are we talking about here in terms of crunching data and making decisions? What's the size of the Offworks database? Is there a number, do you think? Is it 2 terabytes? Is it a petabyte? What are we talking about here? How much data are you guys collecting on an annual basis, maybe?
Oh yeah, so I'll use it in context to where when I was in the utility world. So like when we're collecting like 15-minute reads on 100,000 meters, that generates a ton of data. We in AFWERX aren't doing that kind of data crunching. Ours is more really what we're doing on our data side is tying in a lot of these sources with the business data, so we can try to identify needs for the Air Force. So so you see a lot of companies that are being funded in a particular sector, or we are awarding a lot of companies in a particular sector. How can we identify some of those needs that may not be as obvious if you're just sitting at a base trying to tackle a local problem? So that's really like our data challenge, is tying in these different data sources to identify future requirements. But from a size perspective, we're definitely not like crunching big data in terms of Google, or even like utility scale where you're pulling in a ton of smart meter data.
Okay, a different tangential question here. I'm just trying to get interesting facts from you. So I'm wondering, from your point of view, from the companies that you know of or the things that you have funded, anything interesting? So for example, who would have ever thought that one of the hottest features on cars is cup holders for drinks, right? And nobody really, when they were making cars, I remember the Italians and the Germans refused for many years to put cup holders in their cars. So is there anything interesting that you guys have seen on any of these investments of a technology that everybody went, huh, who knew?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Like I don't know. Like I think one of the funniest stories I've heard, something to that effect, was it was one of I mentioned the spark cells earlier, where it's these like base level teams. This was a team out in Travis Air Force Base, and they wound up saving a fair amount of money because they have in C-17s, I guess, like a cup warmer or a plate warmer or something to that effect. But only one company held the contract. So they wound up creating a way to just 3D print that one particular part, and saving thousands of dollars on each individual piece, right? So I think the cup holder made me think of that. So it's stuff like that's kind of funny when you have these conversations with folks. Like you see the big technology piece, but it's really some of the smaller things that have the most immediate impact. Because like on a car, I can't imagine if I couldn't put my coffee down in the morning when I'm commuting into the office.
That's right.
That car ride would be much less enjoyable.
On the prime side, what kind of interest are you getting from companies in the Space Force? Another big new idea out there that's going to need, a lot of company interest. So are you getting a lot of that now?
Yeah, there's actually a lot, and there was a lot of interest in that during South by Southwest. We had a fair amount of companies that came specifically to talk just about space, because on the prime side so we have Agility Prime that's geared towards the Air Force, and then on the space side we have it's Orbital Prime, which is really focused on debris that's in orbit. So when you think about, like, I don't know, a year ago, I wouldn't have considered that to be a problem, right? But that's one of those things, like, people who are familiar with space, and it makes complete sense if you think about how much has gone into space over the last, half century. Now there's a lot of clutter. So trying to figure out
floating trash.
That's floating to Earth, about to pound Earth, God knows where, probably on your house.
James, how do you measure success? $1 billion of taxpayers' money is a fair chunk of change. How will SBA gauge that it's being well spent and that the Air Force is benefiting from this?
Yeah, so I think the thing that we're looking at now, and we're still, because if we think about like the life cycle of these funds, we're still kind of in the window where we haven't reached where we could complete one life cycle, so to speak. But yeah, so the idea is, how do we measure the transition? So what is our matriculation from the point where you do some of, I'll call it seed funding at the very beginning, to what eventually transitions to a full fielded capability at the end. So that I think transition in terms of that is probably going to be one of the key things that we look at. One of the things that the prime team, like that they're considering as well, is how much have they accelerated a commercial market. So in the eVTOL space, Colonel Salinas, he'll tout it if you've ever talked to him about it, where they looked at 2028, 2030 as kind of like the target for when the eVTOL market would develop. And now they talk about it being 24, 25. So can we take complete credit for that? Probably not. Can we take a fair amount of credit? Hopefully. So that's one of the things that we're still trying to hash out. What does that success look like? And not only that, but what do those key stakeholders up at the congressional level or federal agency level, what are they measuring as success for us?
Do other branches of the military have an AFWERX project, AFWERX type project?
Yeah, so it's actually one of the real benefits of being here in Austin is that all the services are pretty early on in that. Army Futures Command, they have a full dedicated command here in Austin that is getting after the same type of problem. The Navy has Naval X. There's actually DIU, Defense Innovation Unit, which looks at it from a joint service perspective. So and all of those folks, we have presence here in Austin. So each of the services is trying to get after it in slightly different ways. We all approach it a little different, but each service recognizes that there's a need to kind of look at things a little differently and set aside some folks who are dedicated to do that.
Do you get together and share your ideas?
We do, yeah. There's actually a fair amount of collaboration. The office right next to mine is actually the Texas Military Department's innovation officer, but on the facility that we work out of, all of us are on the same floor. So they've kind of set up this Center for Defense Innovation is what Capital Factory calls it. So that way you can have some of that serendipity where you're just at the coffee pot and like, oh, hey, I wanted to talk to you about this project.
Right.
I imagine that you have what amounts to a zero-sum game. So much that I hear about is limited by policy or by funding. But as you're purely innovators and you don't have to go out and get money and make a profit on anything that you're doing, that you're in a rather marvelous place for innovation. Do you feel that sense of liberty from the normal pressures that commerce, for example, labors under?
I do. I think it allows us some of that freedom that if I were, in a different environment, I would have to answer under a different kind of metric, right? Like the ROI that we're looking at is a little different, where I don't have to match up an effort to an expected revenue number. So I think that allows us to approach it in a little different way. It gives us a little more freedom to say, oh, this is an interesting idea. And I'm not sure what the payoff would be, but we can approach it and not kind of be worried about, I would say, like shareholders.
I was the keynote speaker at a marvelous conference, and I went to the following one, and then COVID and one thing and another, and they didn't do them. But that NASA ran in Houston, which was the thing that was very interesting. I don't know if it was designed that way, is there was no policy and no money discussed, just ideas. So that you didn't have somebody sighing and say, we could just get the funding, we could do this, or if only the government would look in that direction. If you take the money temporarily, take the money and the policy out of it, then you can really look at ideas untrammeled in a way that you cannot otherwise. And it would seem to me that you have some of that advantage.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the real benefits is because like we're in relation to the broader Air Force, we're a really small team. So
Yeah.
our primary objective is to enable all the other innovators that are spread out across the force. So we don't have the burden of coming up with all the good ideas. We don't have the burden of executing a lot of the good ideas. We have to find ways to enable all those cool ideas. So I think that's where you've divorced some of that, where the folks that are at the base level, like we can give them access to the money, so they're not worried about going and finding the capital to do whatever they need to do. And similarly, it's not just on us to kind of find these good ideas. So I think it's a really good opportunity, and it's a really good place, especially if you like trying things out that are new. It's been an exciting piece.
So I'm curious, James, do you drive an electric vehicle?
I do not.
Not yet. Not yet. Do you have solar panels in your house?
No, not yet.
Not yet. No power wall either. It's coming, right?
Yeah.
What's your take as a civilian of the most disruptive technology out there today? Is it the electric vehicle? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think electric vehicles just distributed. If I look at it from like my perspective, like in my time in the utility, both water and energy, just the growth in that space to be able to enable distributed generation, both water, right? Because water is still highly centralized, as well as energy, where it's, transmission is a killer for us in Texas, right? Especially as you bring on some of these new generation sources. So trying to get demand closer to end use as a civilian, but also as in the military, like that's ultimately like our resource challenge, right? Like just pulling that generation closer to it. So and it's just a super interesting space to me. So any final thoughts, anything that you want to promote or make us aware of, any event coming up or anything that we should know about you guys? Yeah, I would say if I was going to promote one thing, it's we have what's called an open topic model, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but we don't release, hey, submit ideas in this particular category. We just ask companies to submit whatever they think their idea is. So right now we are in an open cycle. So if you went to AFWERX.com, you can find out information on how to submit that if you're a small business and you're interested in working with the Air Force on whatever your idea is. We'll review all of those proposals and see which ones we'll select to fund to try out. Brilliant.
Linda, any parting thoughts?
I think this is really great that the Air Force is working on this and that they're sharing what they learn with the other branches of the military. It's all a plus as, we move into this exciting space future, whether it's collecting, the junk that's up there or, living somewhere on another planet, getting there, getting there. And the things that we do in a terrestrial way. It's just an exciting time. And I know that the Air Force is quite a leader in innovation. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with AFWERX.
Yeah, Llewellyn?
I would like to endorse that. And so just one hesitation I have. At one time, I used to give speeches. Every year I gave a speech at the 3 big weapons national labs. And it was a wonderful experience. But I got to know the labs very well. I even worked with them on technology transfer. But the frustration was the wonderful things they invented that never got out of the lab. And in the end, it had a corrosive impact on the lab. It might have done the same thing at Bell, I don't know, but it was Los Alamos, Sandia, and Lawrence Livermore that I gave these speeches at, and spent a lot of time talking to frustrated people who couldn't get anyone to adopt these marvelous inventions. One of them was, for example, was ceramic ports for abusive uses in engines. All the motor manufacturers said, well, if the Japanese do it, we will. And similar things about almost everything. There was a lot of frustration and a sense that it was so bureaucratically cumbersome to get an idea from the lab into a manufacturing facility that people just sort of gave up. How do you overcome that? And have you overcome it? Do you live with it, or is it not a factor of your life?
I think that's probably still a challenge in some ways. But I think that's one of the reasons why us being under the Air Force Research Lab specifically helps, because we can connect, because there's a manufacturing aspect, but the other aspect is the labs just have to have somebody to give that technology to. So they need an end use. And so we can connect those end users to that capability that's coming out of a lab. So I think that's the benefit, specifically to the Air Force.
I think that what you're doing is marvelous, very exciting, and it's been wonderful to have you on the program. And you're
Absolutely,
you're a very articulate guest, I might say.
I appreciate that.
Thanks
great.
for
I
being
really
with us
appreciate you having
today,
me on.
James. We could speak for hours to you. And a final question that I would remiss not to ask of an Air Force guy. So have you seen Top Gun yet?
I have not. It's on the calendar to do this weekend.
Excellent. Well, next time we talk, I want to hear your recommendation on it. I hear it's a fabulous movie, and I'm looking forward to seeing it myself.
All right.
I'm just going to pretend they're all Air Force pilots.
I am a private pilot, and what the Air Force does in airplanes would frighten me to death before I even started doing it. Take care.
All right.
Wonderful to be with you. Cheers.
To the wild blue yonder.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.